media afterlife of classics. And so I wanted to focus my attention on the non-academic agents of classical reception, like game developers and 3D artists, to the extreme of the non-human itself, software. I wanted to understand how various kinds of software used in game development might curate antiquity, how it decides what is Greek, what is Roman, and which aspects of antiquity to receive, represent, and make available for widespread commercial use by game developers all over the world. So let me begin with a brief introduction to the three types of software I'll be discussing. So this is Unity. Unity is a game engine, which is a software development platform that provides a framework of code that facilitates the collaboration of game designers, programmers, artists, musicians, writers, and anyone who works on creating games. Think of it as the Microsoft Word of game development, but much more complex. Instead of just being able to format your paragraphs, change font, or add page numbers, a game engine allows you to add in 3D landscapes and character models, lighting, sound, and a physics system, and essentially run a game within the space you've created. Also, in the screenshot, you can see a grid full of many different objects. These objects are called game assets, which can refer to any digital object that might conceivably be used as part of a video game, be it a character model, a 3D landscape, a piece of architecture, an animation sequence, or a piece of music. As you can see, these game assets are able to be imported into game engines and therefore be made available for use when needed. Finally, an asset store is an online marketplace where asset creators and artists can upload and sell game assets that are already optimized for convenient integration with its associated game engine. On these asset stores, game developers can purchase pre-made assets, greatly speeding up their own process, since they won't have to create these assets from scratch. As you can see, all three forms of software, game engines, game assets, and asset stores, work in tandem with one another. The game engine in particular plays a highly central, unifying, and framing role in the entire creative process. In theory, any studio or even an individual freelance game developer with sufficient expertise, time, and resources could build their own game engine for in-house use. In most cases, however, this just isn't a feasible option. Instead, since the mid-2000s, the landscape for game engines has gone through significant platformization, which is a social, economic, and technical phenomenon which involves the convergence of production and consumption practices across an industry onto a small number of global platform behemoths. The most well-known analogy I can think of is Netflix, the world's largest television streaming platform that has cornered so much of the global market that what it decides to stream on its platform or recommend on its front page can greatly determine the exposure and success of a new show. As an example of how platform behemoths govern consumer behavior and constrain patterns of creative consumption, many Netflix users decide what show to watch solely based on what they come across on the platform. At the same time, this capacity to monopolize user attention causes smaller streaming platforms to lose viability and die out, killing off the alternatives. In a similar fashion, a large proportion of games are now produced using one of two commercially available game engines, the first being Unity, which you've seen earlier, and Unreal Engine. In 2022, it was announced that Unity accounted for 50% of all games across mobile, PC, and console, including 72% of the top 1,000 mobile games. Unreal Engine, known for its hyper-realistic and graphically intensive capabilities, was announced to be responsible for half of all the announced games coming from next-generation consoles like the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. The point being that Unity and Unreal Engine aren't simply fringe pieces of software that a game studio might opt to use. Rather, they are the industry standard for a multi-billion-dollar business. These dominant platforms entrench themselves over time by means of many intertwining path dependencies. For instance, because of Unity and Unreal Engine's position as the de facto tools of the industry, other game engines go out of their way to ensure easy integration with them. Havok, a game engine known for its advanced physics system, which Nintendo uses for some of their Zelda games, specifically advertises on their website easy integration with Unity and Unreal Engine. Being able to switch between game engines offers important flexibility in the production process, especially since many studios prototype early versions of their game using Unity and Unreal before switching over to other engines. Additionally, game design courses in schools and other educational settings have become increasingly tied to specific engines like Unity, teaching new game developers how to use specific software as opposed to broader principles of game design and more transferable coding skills, further entrenching these platforms through prevailing currents of software literacy. Given the dominance of Unity and Unreal Engine within the game development landscape, these game engine platforms function as creative infrastructures that mediate and shape future cultural production. Recent scholarship on game engines has focused on scrutinizing the promise of unrestrained creativity that Unity, for instance, advertises of its software. Through extensive interviews, scholars have found that many developers recognize how the engine's tools, user interface, and technical capabilities have led to the creation of numerous games with a distinct Unity feel, a discernible uniformity in art direction, controls, lighting, physics, camera angles, and so on. While attention has been given to the creative constraints imposed by the game engines themselves, what interested me more were their asset stores. The Unity Asset Store was launched in 2010, while the Unreal Engine Marketplace was launched in 2014. In both cases, the asset stores were released only after the widespread commercial uptake of their game engines. Customers of these asset stores include developers of all sorts, from large AAA studios to smaller indie studios, to students and hobbyist game developers. These developers purchase assets to effectively outsource time-consuming and labor-intensive asset creation work, and thereby expedite their own game development process. In return, the asset stores generate a profit by withholding a share of each transaction. The Unity Asset Store takes a 30% cut, while the Unreal Engine Marketplace takes 12%. At the same time, these asset stores function as a form of marketing, advertising to developers the convenient access to a wide range of available assets that comes with using their associated game engine. As you can tell from these two screenshots, among the many assets sold on both platforms are those inspired by ancient Greece and Rome. Given the prominence of historical and fantasy elements in video games, this is a popular and wide-ranging category comprised of various character models of heroes, gods, gladiators, legionnaires, the occasional senator, as well as objects like weapons and ships, and architectural elements like temples, villas, monuments, marble statues, and even entire cityscapes. Just like any other online marketplace, such as Amazon, these asset stores make use of a robust search and recommender system, which allows users to locate assets that they might need for their game in an efficient and targeted manner. Whether Greek or Roman is searched, both asset stores each produce hundreds of search results, offering a visually suggestive frame of reference for the kinds of objects, images, and themes that engage classical material in some way or another. Each search result is framed by a usually representative thumbnail image, along with the asset title, the seller's name, buyer rating, price, and of course, an option to add directly to cart. Clicking on a specific asset takes the user to a much more detailed individual asset page, which includes additional images that showcase each aspect of the asset, unique pieces, different angles, close-ups on intricate carvings, or highlights of special features. Some creators also include videos that may offer a guided tour of the 3D environment or showcase an animation sequence. On top of these visual representations, asset creators include a written overview and descriptions that can be both technical, for example, file size, supported platforms and polygon count, and qualitative, like this asset is AAA quality or unique or high attention to detail. Within the context of an online business-to-business marketplace, each element of the asset store fulfills an obvious commercial function of presenting detailed product information to potential customers. My intervention is that these platformized asset stores do not simply facilitate the sale of classical assets in a purely neutral, mechanical sense. Their dominant position in the market imbues them with suggestive force and transforms them into broader infrastructures of imagination, pertaining to the use and deployment of Greek and Roman material, outlining, for instance, the particular aspects of a game where historical material might be incorporated, be it in character design, environments and landscapes, objects and equipment, as well as the art style, level of detail, and mode of realism that should structure their representation. And perhaps most of all, these asset stores signal which aspects of the classical past warrant selective adaptation for video games. For example, Rome's imperial military as opposed to lesser-known Greek rustic cult practices. Cultural signals like these subtly inform the classical imagination of actors throughout the game industry, developers, artists, hobbyists, students, and other asset creators. More importantly, these cultural signals attain the backing of material and commercial force once they begin to influence practical considerations like asset availability, supply, price, artistic expertise, consumer familiarity, and demand. By mediating the flow of historical material in this manner, these asset stores are transformed into unexpected yet influential sites where ancient history and modern game development become embroiled in a sociotechnical discourse around cultural production. So one of the main ideas I'm working with has to do with the concept of search. Given the everyday nature of search and the reliance that society has developed on search engines like Google, many of us tend to take for granted the behind-the-scenes epistemological work that underlies the sleek, simple, and minimalist search boxes that we have grown accustomed to. This book, Invisible Search and Online Search Engines by scholars Hyder and Sundin, foregrounds the non-neutrality of search engines and a misguided perception of them as objective relayers of information. In fact, the authors preclude that possibility entirely, arguing that there is no possible way to provide a neutral or objective search engine. The question has to be, how are they biased and how visible are the various biases, bracket in the plural. One second, I'm gonna take a sip of water. So when thinking about search in relation to the afterlife of classics on the internet, I like to think of search not just in terms of epistemology, the idea of knowledge, its reliability, and our ability to articulate that knowledge. I like to think of search also in terms of ontology, how it relates to existence and reality. In an age where the internet is construed by the vast majority of people as the ultimate font and repository of knowledge, the implication of searchability is an existential one. To be found on the internet is to exist. Conversely, if something can't be found on the internet, the vast majority of the world won't know that it exists. Asset stores, as with most other forms of information infrastructure, are heavily reliant on search. In order to understand how historical material is shaped by and produced on these software platforms, we need to figure out exactly what processes are going on behind this search box here, highlighted in red. We need to figure out what parameters are being used whenever someone searches for something related to the classical world. If one were to enter Greek into the search box of the Unreal Engine marketplace, the majority of search results will align with a popular imagination of Greece as it circulates in the video game landscape and broader pop culture. Plenty of statues, warriors, temples, gods, heroes, mythical creatures, and so on. For the game developers hoping to incorporate Greek assets into their game, they might browse asset stores' offerings in search of relevant material and ask themselves, will this asset fit the vision of my game? Modify and make use of this. Is the time and effort saved by purchasing this worth the cost? But since I'm interested in the hidden analytical work underlying the asset store's search operations, I found myself intrigued by a different set of questions. When you search Greek, which assets show up and in what order? What shows up that shouldn't have, and what doesn't that should? And most importantly, who or what is it that decides? Like most search engines and online marketplaces, both the Unity Asset Store and the Unreal Engine Marketplace make use of algorithms, and the first piece of information that they feed these algorithms is a form of asset classification decided by the asset stores themselves. This takes the form of broad categories like characters, props, and environments. The The Unity Asset Store has a second layer of categorization with more genre-specific subcategories like fantasy, historic, sci-fi, and so on. But even then, these forms of classification make only partial headway in sifting out classical material amidst the many other represented histories, cultures, and fictions. They won't really get you too far. To narrow down the search further, creators are invited to provide a number of searchable buzzwords. The Unity Asset Store uses the phrase related keywords, as you can see highlighted in red on the right, while the Unreal Engine Marketplace uses the term tags, also highlighted in red. These searchable keywords will play a big part in my analysis. Unity provides a publicly available Unity user manual on its official website, which includes an entire section on how to add keywords to assets. There, the manual emphasizes the importance of keywords in shaping the hidden metadata of the website, and thereby the searchability of their products, couching this to creators in very straightforward commercial terms. They are very beneficial for your assets, as they will make them easier for potential customers to locate them within the store when using the search bar. We also learned, however, that Unity reserves for itself the final say. The manual instructs sellers to add a submission comment for our asset store specialists describing why you chose your keywords. Our asset store specialists will vet keywords to ensure that they are relevant to your asset. In exercising ultimate control over the search parameters, the relevant Unity employees, these asset store specialists, become co-authors alongside the asset creators themselves of the technical, cultural, and historical identifiers of assets sold on the platform. But knowing which human actors are involved takes us only part of the way in understanding how Greco-Roman antiquity has come to be recognized, defined, and re-articulated on asset stores. Another question is raised: how exactly do asset creators and asset store specialists participate in the platform's determination of what counts or doesn't count as possible? Such a question of classification and definition is one that classicists themselves have trouble untangling. In his aptly titled article, What is Classical About Classical Antiquity?, James Porter restates this age-old dilemma with a fair bit of humor. So strong are the assumptions about what the classical and classicism are, we tend to forget that objects do not surface from the ground or emerge from ancient libraries wearing a sign with the label classical written across their face. When ancient objects themselves, as Porter suggests, do not always offer easy markers of their origins or historical status, it is quite the curiosity that software like asset stores expect digital representations and simulacra of ancient material to be accompanied by a comprehensive selection of 20 or so identificatory keywords. Interestingly enough, such a process is perhaps not too far off the mark from the socially constructed nature of what we have come to recognize as the classical. Porter suggests that the classical is not a quality that is somehow innate in certain objects, events, or themes, and it cannot be recognized in this way. Rather, he posits that the classical is only identifiable through a kind of inarticulate knowledge that necessarily exists within a broader structure of feeling, a vague, indefinite, but most importantly, shared sense that a certain object belongs to a now inaccessible, broadly Greco-Roman past. Porter takes inspiration from Bordeaux's concept of habitus, a kind of cultural inculcation, and suggests that our best avenue of inquiry presents itself in viewing the classical as a set of dispositions that organize social behavior, which directs us to the inarticulate knowledge of the practitioners of a given social field or game. Bordeaux's conception of an intersocial cultural game offers a productive analogy for what I suggest is a game of interpretation being played between various actors, with the asset store as their arena. A game for which the stakes might be the classical imagination itself, and how it is received, understood, and then perpetuated within the landscape of video game production. And for this game, the Unity user manual serves as a kind of informal rulebook. While the bulk of its instruction is primarily administrative in nature and relays only basic information framed around obvious commercial logic of maximizing searchability and customer traffic on an online marketplace, There is some surprisingly profound advice offered in step 6. Before you, a publisher, add keywords for your asset, think about what kind of search terms you expect developers to use in order to find your asset. Think about how users search. Regardless of whether or not the asset's sellers choose to heed this advice, this platform-sanctioned reflection on both searchability and cognition reveals how the asset store articulates its own sociotechnical infrastructure, where its various users are made to engage in an exercise of image and word association as they pertain to the classical. This game of interpretation begins with developers who generate the demand for assets and perform directed searches on asset stores to find relevant classical material for the projects they are working on. Asset creators are confronted with the task of thinking one step ahead, to imagine how game developers engage with their game-making process, and to anticipate the kind of classically inspired assets they should create in order to support them in that process. Meanwhile, the thought processes of both asset creators and game developers are inevitably framed by some degree of speculation, prediction, and market research as to the sort of classical material that players, the end consumer of both their products, might expect or hope to see in the games they play. To complicate matters further, all participants are jointly tapped into a network of transmedia discourses around the classical within a global cultural landscape, which in turn shapes the trends, discourses, and predictions of cultural interests of the game industry. Within the arena of the asset store, the stage is therefore set for a complex game of interpretation, with each networked actor contributing to the platform's eventual construction of the classical. This is a game for which the stakes go beyond just searchability. In fact, the stakes might be the classical imagination itself, how it is received, understood, and then perpetuated within the landscape of video game production. This is because these intertwining interpretations shape the very infrastructures of cultural production by first influencing searchability, visibility, and representation. But this is then responded to by commercial and economic decision-making within the game industry, influencing practical considerations of asset availability, supply, pricing, expertise, and demand. With the backing of material and commercial force, these interpretations eventually structure creative ideation itself, as it pertains to the imagined uses and relevance of the past within the present. This gets at the crux of how asset stores inadvertently situate themselves as an ontologically generative site for the classical. In this sense, cultural software, like asset stores, speak Antiquity into its contemporary, socially constructed existence on the web. In contrast to the continued afterlife of the classical within academic and curatorial settings, where the real classical precedent of text, material, evidence, and source is brought to the foreground, the algorithms used by cultural software platforms like asset stores, strictly speaking, require no real material basis to construct the classical searchable existence. They already have all they need: code, keywords, and the human actors who produce them. As a complementary mirror to the earlier section centered on the topic of search, this section is interested in the aspects of the classical that cannot be found in the asset store. Popular visions of classical antiquity tend to fixate on men of action, for instance, on Greek heroes and warfare, Roman gladiators, imperial expansion, and the blood-soaked politics of state. But what's missing? One of the revelations I've made during this foray into asset stores as mediators of historical culture is that what we might qualitatively recognize as a literary or cultural vacuum can also be understood quantitatively as a void of data and approached accordingly. In her project on missing datasets, media researcher Mimi Onoha says that the word missing is inherently normative. It implies both a lack and an ought, something that does not exist but should. That which we ignore reveals more than what we give our attention to. It's in these things that we find cultural and colloquial hints of what is deemed important. Although Onoha's concern is with data collection biases that affect social justice issues such as the underreporting of abuses against undocumented immigrants, her explanation holds true even for the skewed representation of classical material within the data-saturated environments of online platforms. Things don't just spontaneously go missing. They go missing because we've forgotten that they're supposed to be there. And this tends to happen when we are deeply preoccupied with other things. Therefore, to understand what is missing, we must simultaneously attend to the forms of classical perception that are heavily represented, the stories, objects, images, and narrative structures that asset stores and game development more broadly have invested themselves in perpetuating. Certainly not least among these are the stories that survive about the heroes of classical epic, men like Achilles and Odysseus and Aeneas, who single-handedly turn the tides of war, who undertake and complete harrowing divine journeys, who found empires that leave a mark on history. Similarly, our literary, historical, and material sources are sufficient to paint a vivid picture of Roman gladiatorial games, which have become another element of the classical past which the game industry has eagerly latched onto, potentially at the exclusion of other possibilities that might be ripe for ludic adaptation. For instance, if one were to search for Gladiator on either of these asset stores, they would be greeted with a sizable number of hits. The Unity Asset Store offers 98 search results, while the Unreal Engine Marketplace offers 44. The wide selection of Gladiator-related assets comprise mostly of highly detailed and fully animated character models found in a variety of art styles, from vivid, hyper-realistic models intended for more graphically intensive PC or console games, to blocky, colorful, and stylized models designed with mobile games in mind. Taking the Gladiator A asset as an example, these asset pages are complete with photos from all angles, customization options, video showcases of the possible animations, and even a 360-degree showcase of the asset with a camera that a user can adjust. Accompanying these character models are also numerous environmental assets, such as the Colosseum and other gladiator arenas, demonstrating how a journey through these asset stores can supply most of the artistic building blocks for the making of various sword and sandal and gladiator-inspired games. Now, imagine that a game developer wants to have an enemy for the gladiator to face in combat within the arena. Better yet, if it's an iconic mythological creature like the Minotaur. If one were to perform a search for Minotaur, they would find an impressive 68 hits on the Unity Asset Store and 33 on the Unreal Engine Marketplace. Once more, the user will be greeted with a selection of highly detailed and animated models with a huge range of possible price points, from a simple model being offered for free to a couple of good options priced at 15 USD, to a whopping 75 USD for an elaborate Minotaur Barbarian package that comes with detailed animations for attacking, dying, moving around, and even minute animations that convey different facial expressions. For example, you might be able to see a truly detailed yawning animation for the Minotaur Barbarian when he's tired. On the other hand, suppose that someone was interested in making a game about Greek rustic cult practices and their patron goddess, Demeter. We might perform a search for Demeter on both of these asset stores, much to their disappointment. The Unreal Engine Marketplace offers not a single hit, while the Unity Asset Store shows a single unrelated search result, directing the user to an asset cleaner tool. A handy piece of software, perhaps, but certainly not what they were looking for. It should be qualified, however, that this by no means entails that representations of Demeter have not been attempted before in video games. She appears, for instance, as one of the player's Olympian benefactors in the highly popular and award-winning video game Hades by Supergiant Games. Similarly, Eleusis, a first-person horror adventure game, offers one attempt at exploring a set of rustic ritual practices surrounding Demeter, known as the Eleusinian Mysteries. According to the scholar Rossclair, the game draws the player into an eco-feminist interpretation of the mysteries, recasting those ritual practices into a psychologically unsettling narrative frame for exploring the possibility and threat of environmental reclamation. Although my objective so far has been to emphasize the influence that game development software has on the representation of classical material, I do hope to also acknowledge the instances where game developers demonstrate an intentionality about representing lesser known aspects of the classical world and to recognize these countercurrents to prevailing patterns of creative production, and which are not necessarily able to be captured solely by analyzing asset stores, which are marketplaces where sellers are inherently incentivized to market products that cater toward wider and more general use. These countercurrents are, in essence, a blind spot in the data that must be acknowledged. In fact, representing lesser-known aspects of Greek myth is something that supergiant games have repeatedly stressed as a key objective of theirs when making Hades. That being said, commercial game engines and their asset stores continue to manifest clear preferences for some types of possible assets over others. In doing so, these game development software platforms selectively receive certain aspects of the classical past while overlooking others. Nor do these disparities spontaneously emerge from a cultural vacuum. The wide offering of high-quality gladiator-inspired assets, for example, can almost certainly be traced to the influence of transmedia cultural flows, such as the explosion of sword and sandal gladiator-inspired films and television shows from the year 2000 to the mid-2010s, such as Gladiator, 300, the Spartacus miniseries, and the Spartacus TV series, all pervading the cultural imagination around the time when commercial game engines were being platformized and their asset stores were starting to emerge. Furthermore, this selective appropriation takes place in line with the dominant combat-driven model of game design, one that lends easy appeal to gladiators and mythological creatures, assets perceived as more widely usable or likely to be in demand. The sizable presence of gladiatorial material compared to the near absence of rustic cult practices and the associated deities like Demeter is only one example of the skewed representation of classical material on asset stores. On their own, asset stores are not determinative of creative production, nor are they capable of generating cultural signals out of thin air. Yet, by directing and diffusing cultural signals from existing video games and other popular transmedia depictions in literature, film, television, comics, graphic novels, and animation, they propagate prevailing cultural imaginaries and foster creative path dependencies at a material level by incentivizing the creation of certain types of high-quality assets and making them readily available for wide commercial use on an online marketplace. The entanglement of game development software within these currents of cultural and historical representation then has circular and cumulative implications, especially once those sought to create material and practical factors. These factors ring true even more so for smaller studios, which might be more reliant on pre-made assets than larger studios with teams of artists. As things stand, it would be far simpler, easier, cheaper, and faster to procure all the assets needed for a game where gladiators fight minotaurs in an arena than to obtain a single asset depicting Demeter. It is highly unlikely to be a coincidence that we now have this long list, which is already greatly abbreviated, of gladiator-inspired video games over the past 2 decades. Maxwell Foxman observes this as a consequence of game engine platformization. The multitude of creative possibilities are increasingly locked in, which affects all stages of game development and manifests in countless ways. One of these ways is how classically inspired assets are created and sold within the video game development landscape. So I initially planned to end by discussing some of the latest developments in game asset creation using photogrammetry, essentially how 360-degree scans of classical artifacts and landscapes are increasingly being used to create game assets. As part of a kind of inverted sequence, I hope to scale back the discussion at the very end by exploring the undeniable connections between the online vision of antiquity and the literary, historical, and archaeological material that scholars are more used to working with. But as I was preparing this talk, I quickly realized that doing so might require an entire session on its own. So instead, I thought I might end by just briefly sharing some of my motivations and thought processes as I worked on this paper. When I began, I brought up the concept of decentering the processes of the higher education and curation in order to grasp the new media afterlife of classics. As I conclude, I wanted to tie together some of those thoughts with discussions of access and the central place of the internet and new media as vehicles of culture. For the vast majority of society who perhaps don't have any formal or informal education in classics, or who perhaps live outside of the West or in parts of the world where classics may not be taught in schools, or manifest culturally or physically within the architecture of their cities. For them, encounters with the classical might happen almost entirely in mediated form, be it through video games, film, television, the internet, and so on. While an academic understanding of the classical might hold authority in some sense, the popular classical imagination is authoritative in another, in that therein lies the bulk of outreach, as well as cultural and even economic force. I hope that this project might contribute to the recognition of the internet and other new media as central mediators of classical culture, reaching out in our digital age to a far wider audience than would otherwise be possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. Lots to think about there. So just shifting the view. No, really exciting. Maybe there are lots of really important emphasis on the ways in which this actually changes the way we think about classics and the world, the public at large think about classics, which is one of the important things about perceptual studies, of course. I'll keep an eye on the stream on YouTube for any potential questions, and also questions in the room. While giving people a couple of minutes to think about what questions they want to ask, I can abuse my position as chair and ask the first. Sorry, I'm going to rotate the camera so we see the people in the room. So when they want to raise their hands, and maybe I'll sit down so that I'm also visible there while asking my question. But I was wondering. Going back to the first half where you were talking about asset stores, I couldn't help wondering, and I know this is tangential to what you were actually talking about, but wondering to what degree the content of asset stores and that the stores as a way of sharing content that you've produced, which could include, models produced using photogrammetry or other kinds of 3D modeling tools, to what extent those stores were potentially useful or in fact actually used for academic purposes, for sharing of academic content, for reusing in academic projects, and so forth. And I guess my first thought was that given the commercial focus of that and the focus of a lot of people using these things in games, a lot of people might object that they don't necessarily want their material to be available for free when someone could be using them not only to make money, but for purposes over which I, the creator, have no control. And so then the second part of my question is, do the asset stores, because I saw on at least one of your slides that there was an option in the search settings for free assets, so there must be at least some free assets in there. But are you also able, as an asset producer, to attach something like a Creative Commons license to your assets? So you can say, you can use this, but you have to credit me, or you can use this, but only for non-commercial purposes, or that sort of thing. And what impact would that have on potential academic use of this as a way of sharing for educational resources of, the outputs of, my 3D output? Would I put it in there, and what would I gain or lose by doing so?
Okay, well, I guess I'll address the first half of your question first. I have come across a few papers on how photogrammetry is starting to be used in like cultural heritage situations to recreate entire ruins and landscapes. And I think there was one on Adrian's Villa where the game engine becomes the kind of storage site for this 3D model. So I think it's already being used in archaeological context, but I'm not an expert on that. So I don't know whether it's really become something that's very prominent. I think photogrammetry is something that's only become cheaper and more accessible as of late. Before that, I think it would take too many polygons. That's the understanding I have from my research, that it wasn't feasible to be used in video games up until about maybe 8 years ago when sort of polygon counts in games started to rise, and you can start using these high detailed assets without compromising on sort of the functionality of the game or how much like effort it would take to produce this material. So yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see where photogrammetry goes within sort of archaeological heritage context and teaching as well. I think a great game to talk about, its uses within educational context. I mean, it's obviously Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where I think now the creators, Ubisoft, have made a kind of explorer mode where you can use the bird that your character can summon to fly around and use that to produce photogrammetry even within a digital space. So, and also just to explore. I think that's really fascinating and just really positive development on the whole. And of course, and on your second question, where this is more about the commercial aspects and whether licensing and free assets might come into play, I think it remains to be seen how that will function. I think it's great that more there are asset creators who offer their models for free, allowing students who are practicing with Unity or Unreal Engine to sort of make use of them to make like fun amateur projects and for various purposes. As to whether that, I don't know. I mean, but as to whether that will get massive traction in the long run, I'm less certain. I think it makes sense that most people would want some kind of incentive to do this. And
sure.
I think for the assets, I feel that there's been one creator who's been going around to various museums and across, I think Greece or Italy, and getting permissions to do to have 3D scans taken of the various artifacts, and then selling it on like the various marketplaces. So I'm not quite sure if that was the agreement they had come to, or whether it was done in a kind of that behind the scenes way. So we'll see. We'll see. I think that's a potentially legal issue there.
Yeah. Of course, there's also an academic use of modeling, of not of using scanning to creating, but to reconstruct, an ancient temple or a lost object or something. Those also could potentially create assets.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think that was one of the topics I wanted to talk about if I had included photogrammetry. Because beforehand, for example, in a game like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where it wasn't used, but you would have pictures, of like an ancient object, and the designer would model it in a 3D way, using 3D like art software. It's kind of process of mimesis, as opposed to photogrammetry, where it's more like a translation from one realistic medium into a digital one. And I think that complicates the kind of ontology that's happening. Is this a mimetic representation, or is it more just a more direct translation of something into a digital mode?
Thank you. Anybody else?
There is a question online in the meantime. David McFarlane has asked, he writes, it strikes me that there's a rich field similar to your explorations in library science. The books are analogous to the assets, the tags are the metadata, putting things into stores analogous to cataloging. So the implication of metadata organization and content have parallels, therefore, to your organization, your observations. It's cataloging is also never neutral, right?
Oh yeah, no, that's a great comment. Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense.
Sorry, here.
Oh,
If there's anything else you wanted to say about that, or
oh no, not that much. I think it wasn't quite a question.
sure,
It's a comment that I agree with.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really like the way you explain how classical antiquity is misrepresented as well when it comes to the gaming industry. And I was wondering about if you have an opinion about why you can witness fluctuations in the quality, as well. Sometimes classical antiquity is represented within games, from my own experience, I think about like the Total War games, and there were some titles which were very good in my opinion, but then like others were very bad. So whereas this, goes down to the developers or to the market, maybe just customers at some point just don't care about quality or some other technicalities, whether or not specialists. I don't know to what extent scholars are consulted when it comes to producing, because I don't know how the industry works. But yeah, I was wondering if there was also this element that scholars maybe for some game are not consulted, or are there any other reasons about you have these fluctuations?
I mean, that's a great point. I think that personally, I'm of the opinion that ultimately gameplay and sort of the game design itself is far more important than how the historical material is used. Because ultimately, what makes people want to play a game or whether it succeeds is whether the game is good, whether the company has invested money, as you said, into making something that can be replayed, that's fun, that's well made. And so you have games like, for example, the Assassin's Creed franchise with like Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I mean, that's really a really big budget studio, and they had researchers and archaeologists working on it. But at the same time, just the amount of the production value that went into the game is hugely massive. I'm not personally too familiar with the Total War franchise, but I imagine for some of the longer running franchises like Civilization and Total War, I mean, at some point it might be possible to coast on its name as well. At the same time, like with games like Hades, which is sort of which was sort of the studio's fourth game, Supergiant Games, but they did something really special with Greek myth. I think that led to its huge commercial success. And I think it really depends on the writers and the game developers and how the narrative comes together with all the other elements of the game that define its success. I personally would be hesitant to place the scholar at the center of this success. I think that it's almost a kind of minor contribution at most. And I think that also speaks to my broader project of sort of decentering the scholar from the success of these modes of classical reception in video games. I think we need to acknowledge that in terms of the market, what we do isn't necessarily going to be at the foreground or at the core of what makes a good video game.
Thank you.
It's fairly, I mean, it's been commented in the reception field generally that not only games but filmmakers and so forth, they're interested in authenticity to the extent that they know the audience are interested in authenticity. But that means that to the big studio, at least some smaller studios that have their own passion, but authenticity means being convincing enough to the audience, being what the audience expect to see in something like that, which goes back to your main point. They expect to see what they've seen before. And I'm thinking of the example of Gladiator, where lots and lots of the imagery you see in that with classical things are taken from 19th century paintings, or they have a meeting in a room where there are wall paintings which look like ancient wall paintings that have been damaged by lava, right? Not wall paintings as they would have been when they were people in there. All these sort of things that they show what they think people expect to see. So I guess so I'm trying to turn that into a question, but
Oh no, I mean that's a great point. I think for the longest time, at least before the sort of proliferation of reception studies, and I think I was reading Lorna Hardwick's book on reception studies, and I think she kind of really gets it right on the nail when she says that I think the demands for our modern remakes of the classical to demand authenticity, I think that's a kind of outdated concept. I think really what's more important is sort of blending true, with a much more creative transformation element that makes it relevant and desirable and fun and entertaining for a modern audience. I think it's impossible to go back in class. I think it's, potentially missing the point to expect authenticity or that sort of educational precision from any kind of entertainment media. And with educational media, which is I think what a lot of classes have long been concerned with, I think the problem there is just, there is no uptake. Like once something has been developed with the accuracy and authenticity in mind, if it's lacking a fun factor, I think those are projects that very quickly lose steam, die out. Yeah. And I think we've had a question.
Yeah, well, more of a disagreement or remark. I think I will have to disagree a little bit on the audience and what the audience expects, because the audience doesn't know. I mean, they do not know what they do not know, basically. So it's up to, maybe I sound too traditional right now. I'm coming from an archaeological background, but I think that myths and narratives are relevant, like ancient myths and narratives. And for instance, I will take Odyssey, Assassin's Creed. It was authentic and it was popular. It was it uptook, and I think everybody was pleased. So I think it's up to us to inform the audience as well and train it, not as if they're dogs, but you know what I mean. Just show them that it's still interesting, it's still relevant, because I think it's relevant. I still have, very emotional, the emotional affect is there for me, and it's relevant after all these years. So I will have to disagree a little bit with the audience, because the audience, to my mind, from my conversations with my friends, from tour guiding, from this and that, doesn't really know what is happening. So I think it will be better, I don't know, maybe I'm sounding too patronizing now, I'm sorry, but to combine the authenticity with the experience, yes, but not go to such extent to assume that the audience wants every time this outlandish thing when the narrative is there and it's still interesting. I think, I don't know. I'm sorry.
No. Actually, I don't think we were in complete disagreement. I mean,
Yeah.
There are bounds to which sort of creative transformation should happen, right? It shouldn't be entirely counterfactual to the kind of myths and narratives that we have. But I think, there is a lot of space, I think, as game like Hades has shown, for interpolation or bringing things together, showing conflicting accounts, and sort of creating sort of character dynamics that weren't necessarily there, that piece together all the, the significant voids that we already have, given our lack of material. I mean, there's so much space for both, like transformation and accuracy.
An anecdote, though, from the studio's point of view, was again from the film Gladiator. I'm sorry to keep coming back to that. That dates me. That the filmmakers of the Gladiator film, they hired a Harvard professor to be the consultant.
We do have like first-hand accounts.
Right.
Yes.
Kathy Coleman about the Gladiator.
But the point is that they hired, and they gave her quite a lot of money, and then they ignored almost everything she said. And to the extent that she asked not to be credited because she thought it was a bit embarrassing, and they said, no, you signed a contract, we're crediting you. Because the reason we gave you that money was not because we wanted your input. We wanted to be able to say, we have a Harvard professor as a consultant for this film. Because, again, the audiences want what they think of as authenticity. It's not, as you say, it's not the same thing as what we think of as historical accuracy or mythological accuracy, but they want some kind of authenticity because that's what they feel they're getting. It's part of the spectrum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think there is room for poetic license. Yes, you have to put your spin, you have to, but at the same time, I think that myths and narratives from the past are still relevant, and that's why you have tragedies still being played, or ancient Greek mythology, or even the Nordic mythology that is taking up right now. So I think we are relevant. I think.
No, I mean, I don't think we were entirely, in disagreement there. But I mean, I think a big reason why Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Hades succeed is because the gameplay, the core, the time that people spend playing and how they play it is good. I think a good narrative or good, like, well-researched, sort of experience is just not enough.
But I think my disagreement stems from people perceiving us as elitist or non-relevant, or what are you doing there? It doesn't make sense, or it's for your consumption. And I disagree. I say that it's for everybody if we market it or if we broaden our scope.
That makes sense. Questions?
Anyone else?
Do you think that with like the increasing like accessibility to classics through like documentaries and like popular books that are like for the general audience and the general public, do you think that will broaden what we see in asset stores and then like further what we see in games?
That's a good point. Possibly. I mean, I'm not too familiar with what's been released lately, but I grew up as a huge fan of the Percy Jackson books, for example. But even then, I mean, I would say it very much still worked within a relatively sort of mainstream understanding of the classical. I mean, it focused on gods, on battles, on demigods. To the point where it almost kind of plays within that same dominant current of myth, right? Myth and heroes as the prime model in which the classical is received. I think there's still plenty out there that isn't. Things like pastoral poetry, or that it's a big part of antiquity, but we don't quite see it finding its way into games in the same way. And that's not to say I'm not a fan of the dominant current. Like, these are probably the games I play the most. But it's interesting. I mean, the concern was that how technologies and commercial currents might preclude us from ever experimenting with these other ways we can use antiquity. I think that's a fear. Not that the existing ones aren't great, but there are many things that we might be missing out on.
Thank you.
Following up on that question, which relates to one of the most interesting things I found about your talk, which was the absence of Demeter in the store. And a lot of these books that are being published, particularly for the young adult audiences, are focusing on these female goddesses and these female heroines, such as Circe, Electra, the Woman of Troy. So how are we seeing the absence of the feminine in these games? And are we seeing particular goddesses that are interacting with these heroes, such as Athena, Aphrodite, more present in these spaces? And is there any move to incorporate these other stories that are burgeoning in the current cultural imaginary of what Greece and Rome were?
That's a good point. I mean, so I think the example I used in my search was on Demeter, but I think if you search for something like, Olympian gods, there might be a few collections which have, kind of all the Olympians represented. So, it's certainly not, it's not like a complete void of female characters, found in these development software. And if you play games like God of War, we know that, Athena is very much present within that. But it's true. I mean, I think overall, if you're thinking of it as like a broader discourse, I mean, it still very much plays within a masculine imaginary of the classical in games. And I think the threat there is that, the female characters start to become also play into the trope of like overly sexualized figures for the male gaze and players. But I think that's changing a lot. I mean, with the demographic of gaming, a growing proportion of female gamers, I think a lot of that is changing, and for the better.
I now really want to play a game with Cersei as a playable character.
Absolutely, that would be great. I want to.
The potential for magic and everything else.
Yeah, you would think that all of like I don't know if in Assassin's Creed Odyssey any of these witch-like characters appeared.
I'm pretty sure they do. And I mean, I know plenty of games where they are playable. I mean, this is MOBA. It's kind of like a multiplayer battle arena called Smite. And you can play as, Hera, Aphrodite, and you sort of sling magic against Poseidon, Zeus, or whoever else. So, no, it's definitely not an example of how, it's not that women aren't represented in this game. It's just perhaps at a lesser degree, or someone specific like Demeter, given that she's not as central to Epic, which is perhaps the main form of literature that that's accessed at a popular level, then she gets heavily underrepresented in particular.
Yeah, and again, it's sort of, and again, I'm not playing these games, so this is coming from a place of ignorance, but if it's being sort of told through these masculine-driven narratives, then it makes sense that the heroines and the goddesses who are most directly corresponding in that masculine sphere are the ones who are going to be emphasized, whereas Demeter and Persephone, who are these icons of girls going into adulthood, that sort of transition that's going to be absent.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, I think in the indie development space, there's a lot more interest in these like underexplored narratives and perhaps even non-combat driven modes of gaming, like story-based games or like choice-based games. I'm pretty sure those are starting to really sort of see these female characters that aren't underrepresented in martial modes of narrative, really starting to come up.
But the example you use, and I think it was very very convincing that you used the asset stores as a sort of litmus test, not only of what has happened, but what is coming down the line, because things would have to change very, very slowly for things to first find their way into the asset stores and into game. They presumably have more impact on, they're impacted by the bigger games and also the movies and other things, but they have more impact on lower budget games rather than the really big ones who presumably don't use the asset stores, they create their own assets.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that is a kind of hurdle, right? That's the point that I'm making. Like, if you want to make a game about sort of lesser represented characters of Antiquity, the option isn't closed to you. You still can, but there is a lot of extra work that you have to do. And perhaps, that's also part of the challenge that you look forward to in sort of crafting your own artistic depictions of these characters. There's a term in STS called affordance. So how like technology isn't immediately determinative of change or influence creativity, but it very much pushes and pulls in that direction. It makes certain options and possibilities much more accessible, the default choice. So much so that there are so many extra barriers to wanting to do something differently. And I think that's the point that these asset stores signal.
Sarah online has also asked a question. Do you know anything about any trends in the developing augmented reality game universe?
Interesting. I'm afraid I'm not too much of an I'm not really an expert at augmented reality games at all, but it could be an interesting space to explore.
How many mainstream games have virtual reality modes now? It's slightly different from the question, but
I'm not too sure, but in this research, I remember seeing a few Gladiator like VR games to let you be the one so chopping people's head off.
That would be particularly effective, wouldn't it? Last call for question. Okay, then let's move from the sort of seminar format to the much more social format. Within the room, we regretfully have to say farewell to those of you on YouTube, but can we all just thank Kevin one more time?